Today we're going to talk about lipids, which are basically types of fats. Lipids are made of three different types of atoms: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. It's similar to carbohydrates, which we talked about earlier, in that they have the same types of atoms, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but they have a slightly different arrangement or structural formula. Lipids have a long chain with many carbon-hydrogen bonds, and they have far less oxygens than carbohydrates. And so one of the big differences is that lipids don't have ring structures as we saw in carbohydrates, but lipids are made of long chains of carbons. Some of the characteristics of lipids include that they are insoluble, or they can't be broken down in water. You think about if you have a greasy pan that you've used to cook some meat or something in, you can't just rinse that out with water. The fat, lipids won't really break down, and it's hard to get that out, and you kind of get a greasy substance on your sponge or your cleaning utensil, so you have to use some soap. Soap is actually what allows lipids and fats to be broken down. Lipids are used often for long-term energy storage. You think about bears that hibernate and other animals that hibernate. They are able to store up a bunch of energy during the summer by eating very fatty foods, and while they're hibernating during the winter, they have that fat storage, that long-term energy storage that helps them to survive. It can also be used for insulation. Animals that live in cold regions, by adding or eating a lot of fatty foods, they can help to build an insulation layer. Think about seals that have blubber or other animals that have blubber, helps to keep them warm in cold climates. So lipids, fat, can be used for long-term energy storage and insulation. The most common form of a lipid is something called a triglyceride. That means that it has three fatty acid tails and one glycerol molecule. The glycerol molecule connects the three fatty acid tails together. And we'll see a picture of that in a moment. And lipids are also a major component of the cell membrane. We talked about the cell membrane a couple units ago, and we saw that it's made up of something of a bilayer of phospholipids. Well, this is basically just lipids with a phosphate attached to it. And so lipids are what is used to make up the cell membrane. There's two types of fats. You've probably heard of these. It's pretty common in food and on nutrition labels. The first is saturated fats that we'll look at, and the second is unsaturated fats. Saturated fats are found in fatty meats and some dairy products. Saturated fats have lots and lots of hydrogen and does not contain double bonds between carbon. I'll show you a picture of that in a second. But basically, in saturated fats, there's no double bonds. These are not heart healthy because they raise low density lipoprotein. This is the bad saturated fat or the bad cholesterol. And some examples again include fatty meat, lard, cream, butter, cheese, and dairy products made from whole milk. Unsaturated fats are the more classically the more healthy fats. They're found in many plant products and lean meats. One of the big differences between saturated and unsaturated is that unsaturated is liquid at room temperature and contains double bonds between carbon atoms, at least one. And so that's a great way to tell the difference between a saturated and unsaturated fat. If it's liquid, if it's a fat and it's liquid at room temperature, then you know that it's an unsaturated fat. These are heart healthy because they raise high density lipoprotein. And some examples of where unsaturated fat would be found is fish, vegetable oils. Nuts do contain some unsaturated fats. Avocados are another good example as well. So here's a good visual description or a difference between saturated and unsaturated. Here is saturated, and this we can see is there's a long chain of carbon atoms right here, and attached to all of these carbon atoms are hydrogens. On the unsaturated, we have a chain of carbon again, but there's a double bond represented by these two lines right here. This double bond is showing us that it is unsaturated, and so there are less overall hydrogen atoms in the unsaturated compared to the saturated, which is the primary difference. And to finish up today, a triglyceride is the molecule that we mentioned and we talked about earlier. A triglyceride is a glycerol molecule. So here's our glycerol. It's 1, 2, 3 carbons. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hydrogens, and then 3 OH, 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 OH. And it has 3 fatty acid tails, and those can be saturated, or unsaturated. And so these hydrogens here are going to be removed, and the saturated or unsaturated tails are connected to these carbons. That's it for lipids. Remember that lipids are fats, and there are some of the major characteristics. They can be used for long-term energy storage, insulation. The most common form is a triglyceride, and they're a major component of the cell membrane.